get on with my talk here. So my title is Zombie Ideas in Marine Ecology, Ruminations Around Thresholds for Hypoxia Impacts. So this is going to be very much kind of ruminations. So, okay. Maybe hit the arrows? There we go. Oh, okay. Okay, very good. Right. So just for some background context on this, the reason I got into hypoxia was work I was doing on Salis sucker in the Lower Fraser Valley. So Salis sucker are an endangered species under the Federal Species at Risk Act, and they're endemic to streams in the Lower Fraser Valley. Here's their global distribution. So you get them in the Lower Fraser Valley. You also get them in northern Washington state. So in the Fraser Valley, they're in about maybe a dozen streams. And hey, you're doing that again. So what did you do? Okay. Okay. So here's a satellite image of the Lower Fraser Valley. And what you notice is that where those Salis sucker watersheds are, the land use is mostly agricultural and urban. That's where all this light green stuff is. And in addition to Salis sucker, there's also endangered Nooksack dace, which are another federally listed species. And all these little streams that they inhabit are really good salmonid rearing streams. They're packed with juvenile coho, juvenile steelhead, juvenile cutthroat trout. All right. And the habitats that Salis sucker like are small streams, ponds, and wetlands that look like this. But the Lower Fraser Valley, the streams have high nutrient loads because of all the agriculture and urban runoff. And as a consequence, you get a lot of eutrophication. And I'm sure you guys mostly know what eutrophication is, but just a quick refresher. Nitrogen and phosphorus inputs trigger high primary production. So a ton of algal growth. That stimulates, when the algae die or just associated with the algae, a lot of bacterial fungal production. And in addition to algal respiration, that respiration really drives down the dissolved oxygen, particularly at night. So you get low dissolved oxygen, and that can result in fish kills, right? So these graphs here show dissolved oxygen logger traces in a normal site that's not eutrophic and a eutrophic stream site. So the vertical axis here is either dissolved oxygen or temperature, and this is over 3 days, and the black indicates night and the white is daytime. So at the normal site, dissolved oxygen is pretty stable, temperature is stable. At the eutrophic site, what you notice is that during the day, oxygen really goes up, and that's because photosynthesis is just producing a ton of oxygen. Once the lights are off at night, DO tanks, and that's because the big biomass of algae is respiring at night, and so are all the associated bacterial and fungi. So DO really tanks, and in this site, it gets close to being anoxic. Okay, here's some photographs of what these stream sites look like. Cows pooping in them, and just high algal biomass. High nutrient inputs, often these lack shade, so tons of light. Consequence, high primary production, high temperature, and low dissolved oxygen, especially at night. So I was doing some work here where I was basically analyzing a whole bunch of dissolved oxygen data in these streams that was collected over the last couple of decades, mostly by Mike Pearson, who is a conservation biologist who's been working on Salis sucker and Nooksack dace in these streams for a long time, but also with some data from a couple of grad students at UBC as well. So what this shows is the frequency distribution, or the relative proportion of low dissolved oxygen by month. And if you look at September, which is the end of the summer when flows are low, temperatures are high, 40% of the reaches that are critical habitat for Salis sucker have minimum dissolved oxygens that are less than 4 milligrams per liter, which is really low. So widespread hypoxia throughout, and this is almost 200 kilometers of critical habitat. So widespread hypoxia. So basically, when I started analyzing this data and working it up, I started to read about about hypoxia and how it's defined, because that's what you do when you start to write things up. And okay, before I mention that, this is in freshwater, right? Eutrophication in freshwater. Hypoxia is also widespread in marine and estuarine systems, right? And this is just a screenshot from a science paper talking about dead zones where hypoxia, you got really low oxygen in the ocean. I'm sure you guys are quite familiar with that. So when I started reading up on hypoxia, I realized there was a big discrepancy between the academic definition of hypoxia and what I consider a common sense definition for hypoxia. So again, let's revisit this temperature-oxygen solubility relationship. If you've got oxygen that's dissolved in water, it's at an equilibrium with the oxygen in the air. And that's based on just diffusion rates in and diffusion rates out. That equilibrium determines the saturation level of dissolved oxygen. So the vertical axis here is dissolved oxygen in milligrams per liter. As temperature goes up, dissolved oxygen goes down. And that's just a physical property of water. I'm sure a lot of you have filled up a glass of cold water, put it on the counter, and then a couple of hours later, as it warms up, you notice there's all these little bubbles that have come out of the water. And that's because the dissolved oxygen at saturation is going down. So a lot of the dissolved oxygen is coming out as gas, right? So this is dissolved oxygen at saturation, that dark line. Saturation in seawater is actually lower than in freshwater, and that's an influence of the salt and the actual biochemistry. I have no clue what that is. But if you've got respiration taking place in the water column, that will reduce oxygen concentrations below saturation. And to me, that's hypoxia because you're below saturation. You can also get supersaturation because if there's a lot of primary production taking place and it's pumping out a lot of oxygen from photosynthesis, it may exceed the capacity to diffuse out of the water. You can also get supersaturation below waterfalls or below hydroelectric facilities where there's a ton of turbulence that's actually driving gas into the water. So that is saturation. So the typical usage of hypoxia in the marine literature, though, is here's a screenshot from a science paper 2018. 2 milligrams per liter is the threshold that's often used to delineate hypoxia. And this line shows 2 milligrams per liter, and that is the common definition of hypoxia in marine environments, which to me is kind of nuts, mostly because you get biological impacts well above this threshold. So this is what I'm going to sort of rant about for the remainder of my talk. And that's what I'm calling a zombie interpretation, because it's something that's perpetuated and the logic underlying it is not really clear to me, and it never has been. So here's this 2018 paper. Again, this is hypoxia at 2 milligrams per liter. And this map shows the global distribution of hypoxic areas using that definition. The key thing here is that if you define hypoxia as 4 milligrams per liter instead of 2, the area and the number of hypoxic areas is going to be way larger, right? So that threshold is actually somewhat consequential. So here's another paper. It's a bit older, 2010. I just grabbed it. These are all good papers. They're really good papers that define a lot of good science. But again, they're using this threshold of 2 milligrams per liter. Here's a paper, 2022. Again, a really good paper. Patterns and drivers of hypoxia in streams and rivers. And again, they're using this 2 milligram per liter threshold. And again, same threshold for their map. To their credit, these guys also are showing figures where, so this is percent hypoxic observations over time. They are including 2 milligrams per liter and highlighting it here, but they're also including other thresholds too. Okay, so why is this an issue? Here's a paper from 2008 by Bakker, Saunier, and Duarte. This is a really good paper, widely cited. They looked at thresholds for hypoxia for marine biodiversity, where they did a meta-analysis where they looked at lethal and sublethal effects of hypoxia for all the taxa that they could find, and then they just looked at what the average was for all those taxa. And here's just a highlight from their abstract. The conventional definition of 2 milligrams per liter dissolved oxygen to designate water as hypoxic is below the empirical sublethal and lethal oxygen thresholds for half of the species they looked at. So what they're saying is that for 50% of their species, they either had lethal effects above 2 milligrams per liter or sublethal effects on growth or behavior that were well above 2 milligrams per liter. So that's a really low threshold for biological impacts. And a couple of figures from their paper here. So this is the median sublethal thresholds in terms of dissolved oxygen going from 0 to, say, 12 for different taxa. So for fishes, 4 milligrams per liter. So most fish are having sublethal effects of low oxygen at dissolved oxygen concentrations that are at 4 milligrams per liter. So that means reduced growth, behavioral avoidance, or whatever. And that's well above your 2 milligrams per liter. So basically, they concluded that conventional 2 milligram per liter threshold, it may signal levels of a hypoxia at which you're going to get a collapse of fisheries, but it's not going to represent those thresholds of species that are actually having impacts well above that. So really, what it looks like is the 2 milligram per liter threshold is a threshold at which you're likely to have catastrophic impacts on ecosystem function, massive changes in community structure, but it's a really, really crappy threshold if you want to avoid that from happening, right? Okay, so I also did a meta-analysis where I looked at thresholds for reduction in fish growth and consumption as a function of reduced dissolved oxygen. And basically, there was about 30 papers that myself and my co-author, Rachel Lee, found where people had done experiments in the lab where they looked at fish growth at fixed levels of dissolved oxygen. When you do that, the average threshold where growth starts to decline is 5.1 milligrams per liter. So that's the threshold where reduced growth is induced. And the reason they're growing less is because if you want to digest food, you need oxygen, right? Digestion is really demanding of your metabolic pathways, and reduced food means reduced oxygen means reduced food, reduced growth. There's a lot of variation among species. These are different species. Some are more tolerant of hypoxia, some are less. Salmonids, for example, those red lines, have significantly reduced growth much more quickly under hypoxia. But if you look at 2 milligrams per liter, most species have started to have reduced growth at that threshold. So the academic literature tends to peg hypoxia at 2 milligrams per liter, which, when you look at the actual data, isn't well supported. So what happens when you look at government regulations? So in other words, dissolved oxygen or water quality guidelines for aquatic life. So I did a short review in this table of those. And for freshwater, the guidelines for dissolved oxygen to protect aquatic life in Canada, for warm water species, they're 5.5 milligrams per liter, 6 milligrams per liter for cold water. England and Wales, it's 4 to 5 for cyprinids, which are typically warm water, 4.5 to 5.5 for salmonids. New Zealand, it's 5 and 6. US, it's 5.5 and 6.5. So for freshwater, most jurisdictions are actually using the threshold for reduction of growth for individual fish as the threshold. So they're getting it right. There's a few that have identified marine or estuarine dissolved oxygen thresholds. For England and Wales, they actually have a gradient going from high to poor. So for high, their threshold's 5.7 milligrams per liter. For poor, it's 1.6. In the US, for growth effects, they're saying 4.8. For mortality, it's 2.3. So again, these are pretty much in line with the science. So this is interesting because The environmental agencies are getting it right in terms of the thresholds lining up with the science. So this is a bit of a reversal because governments are being precautionary and reasonable, more so than the academic use, which is kind of surprising. But it's also worth pointing out that these are guidelines. They're not really enforceable. So there's widespread violation of these water guidelines throughout the lower Fraser Valley, and there has been for the last 20 years. But management agencies, including the ones I work for, the province and the federal government, have basically not really done anything based on that. So that's just a bit of an aside. So does any of this really matter? So is it just semantics, or is there any consequence to this, right? Does it really matter if the hypoxia threshold is set at 2? So I would argue there is. So first, a 2 milligram per liter threshold DO underestimates the actual extent of hypoxia that has a meaningful impact. And this was, oh, thanks, Steve, 5 minutes left. So this was pointed out by Vaquer, Saunier, and Duarte. So again, if this is the number of sites with hypoxia and their area based on 2 milligrams per liter, you can be damn sure it's way more extensive if it's based on, say, 4 milligrams per liter. The other is that 2 milligrams per liter is the range where you expect a catastrophic shift in community structure or a collapse of system function. So if this vertical axis here is, say, fish growth or a surrogate for system productivity, and this is DO, well, if the threshold is at 5 milligrams per liter, if you're over here at 2 milligrams per liter, you're way too late if you're trying to prevent any negative impacts because they've already happened. 5 milligrams per liter is a better threshold, but from a management standpoint, if you want to avoid that, there's a lot of inertia in things like recovering from eutrophication. So if the management goal is that you have to reduce nutrient inputs, you probably need to do that out here at a trigger that's well in advance of that 5 or 10 milligrams per liter, because it'll take 10 or 20 years, depending on what the system is, before those reduced nutrient inputs result in lower concentrations. So in other words, things are probably going to get worse before they get better. And then the last thing is, this is really relevant to managing for no net loss or net land degradation neutrality. So no net loss is a policy, one that's actually been adopted for a long time by DFO, where if there's any negative impacts of development, they got to be minimized and offset or reversed by mitigation or restoration. Land degradation neutrality is really the same thing. Here's a really great reference for it if you're interested. And the idea is, if you don't want development to degrade habitat at a landscape scale, you need to make sure that you have equivalent restoration, if you like, or avoidance or mitigation to maintain the current stock of natural capital. And that's illustrated here. If this is your timeline, and this is your natural capital, where in this case, we're representing that by the area of functioning ecosystem, what we're currently in now is increasing hypoxia over time at an ecosystem level, which represents net loss of that ecosystem function. So if we want to turn that over and have no net loss or increasing, if you're defining your area that's functioning based on 2 milligrams per liter, well, if you use a threshold of 4 to 5 milligrams per liter, you're going to have a much larger impacted area. So your area of functioning ecosystem is actually going to be a lot lower. So what that means is, if you want to manage towards no net loss, if you adopt this more realistic threshold, or rather, if you adopt this high unrealistic one, you're grossly underestimating the scale of management intervention that that's going to be required to reverse that net loss trend, right? So it is really consequential for management how you define those thresholds. Okay, so I'm running out of time, so just a couple of quick take-home messages. First, don't necessarily accept stupid conventions within your field, right? Question dumb stuff, which is really the same as number one. And then the last thing is that we live in a net loss a social economic paradigm. We're in this paradigm of decreasing capital. We tend not to be explicit about it. If we want to transition to a no net loss land degradation neutrality paradigm, we need proper accounting of natural capital, what our current natural capital is, and that includes classifications of system state that are accurate, and they represent the true biological impact. Okay, that's the end of my talk. Thanks for coming, folks.
I work with white sturgeon and hydrodams, and really focused on white sturgeon in BC. And I also, in my talk, really want to emphasize the collaborative model because, again, as David mentioned, we work with the province, but our goal is to kind of link fisheries, freshwater fisheries issues in BC with academic researchers at UBC and elsewhere. So very collaborative and interdisciplinary. I certainly can't do it all. So 3 areas I want to highlight here. The first one is all about recruitment failure and habitat restoration in large rivers. That's really where my focus has been for years, but also some more recent stuff. We had some mortalities of large fish in 2022. That's leading to a collaboration with Juan Jose Alava and Mina Hassanagai, who are here today, who are here in IOF. And then also some temperature stuff, working with Colin Brunner and Trish Schulte and Madison Earhart, and then Mohammed Ayun Lolo has also done some thermal modeling on this species. So some really amazing collaborations, and I think I'm excited about that, and the model works really well. This species in BC, there are 6 populations. There are also populations in the Columbia River and the Sacramento in the US, but we focus on BC. And do I have a pointer? Is this going to point to stuff? Yeah. So here's the Fraser, Lower Fraser, there's a bunch of fish in the Lower Fraser, 10,000 in the Middle Fraser, 1,000 up here. It's these populations in red that are endangered. They're undergoing recruitment failure. That's the Nechako River there. There's about 535 adults plus hatchery fish. And here, this is the southeast corner of BC. There's the Columbia River draining into the US. Also dammed heavily. All those red lines are dams. They're undergoing recruitment failure, and a population in the Kootenay also undergoing recruitment failure. And I'm really going to focus here. So just to, again, locate ourselves geographically, here's the Fraser River, there's Prince George, there's the town of Vanderhoof on the Nechako River, and here is Vanderhoof, an aerial photo, and this is our spawning reach. So a lot of my work happens in this reach. And just for reference, that is the geographic center of BC. So we're kind of halfway up BC, right in the middle. And also just for reference, there's a dam, and 2/3, in 1952, when the dam was built, about 2/3 of the water got diverted out of the basin. So a very massive change that's now been progressing over 70 years. And okay, what does recruitment failure look like? This is going to be the absence of juveniles entering the population. And we looked at that. This is a plot that Carl Walters and I and others put together. By using the age of the fish that we have, these old adults, you can age them, you can see when they were born, and more importantly, you can see when they stopped being born. And that essentially is 1967, which is kind of neat because the dam went into 52. So you start saying, okay, it isn't the direct impact of the dam, but something else happened. Luckily, we have a really interesting data set from a Water Survey of Canada gauge site that whereas the Water Survey is interested in the water elevation, we were actually interested in the bed elevation. And you can kind of tweak the numbers and work it backwards and figure out that the bed elevation increased starting in 1967. And this got us thinking about changes in the river bed structure and how those are related to the flow. And then, but more importantly, how are those related to white sturgeon recruitment? So we started asking the question, what's the interaction between the early life stages of sturgeon and sand? And it's actually not, I mean, if you know the salmonid literature, it's not a surprising relationship, but nobody had worked it up in sturgeon. And this is some of my work. The most important is here, this piece on the left. So at 1 day old, they look like that. People used to think that they needed to drift a certain ways. You know, they would hatch and then they would drift. A bunch of my work showed that no, they actually want to hide. But if you give them substrates here that have interstitial habitats, they will hide. If the substrates lack interstitial habitats, all of them drift. This was done in a flume that's 1.5 meters long, so it's really done on the bench top, but it shows this kind of on-off relationship that is strong enough to generate recruitment failure. And that, in essence, those 2 plots kind of show what we've been working on for 15 years now. There was a change in the river, started in 67 and it continues. It affects this biology, makes them go from this kind of being able to hide to not being able to hide. We've also put predators in tanks. We've done a whole bunch of this kind of flume study. And really, I mean, if they have no place to hide, they get eaten. So mortality goes way up in the absence of hiding spots. Oh, sorry, just quickly, we've done this in the field in small mesocosm studies. And then in 2011, we got into a larger scale work. Here we are in the Nechako River in Van Hoof, putting material down in known spawning sites. And that had really two effects. It worked in that we got the material down. If you look here, there was a pulse of juveniles in our juvenile monitoring system, not huge, but we did detect juveniles 2 and 3 years later. But you can also see here, sand moved in and infilled the interstitial spaces. So yes, we could do something. It lasted for one spawning season. My apologies, did seem to create juvenile recruitment, although that's an N of 1, so you have to be skeptical, but it infilled. And that led to multiple years of studying how sand moves through this reach, because it's an atypical reach. This is, again, these are the locations where we put these spawning patches down. One's here, we actually put another one here, and this is the one that infilled. If you went today, you might see something like that on the bottom. But the other one looked something like this, and it still does over 10 years later. And what we learned is sand has a very strange movement pattern. This was this collaboration with fluvial geomorphologists in the geology department and consultants. But sand preferentially moves through the northern part of these side channels, and you can see massive sand accumulations right here, right above their main spawning site. Sand, for some strange reason, does not appear to move down this channel, and so this site stays pretty clean. Unfortunately, fish don't spawn here very often. Most of them spawn in and around the bridge. So we have to figure out how the heck are we going to restore habitat in an active river channel where sand continues to come down every year. And we've got to get over this idea of we'll do restoration and then we'll be done, because we sort of tried that. It didn't last. So we've tried a variety of things. I'll skip this just to show that we've done a whole bunch of other hydraulic modeling, sediment sampling over many years. But where we're at now, we've tried cleaning with divers, tried cleaning with machines in the river. Neither of them seem to be super effective. We've been working with this company that has built what we call a tube screen. And if we drag that over some test habitats, there's the untreated substrate, there's a low intensity and a high intensity treatment. And so that looks really good from an interstitial spaces perspective. The challenge here, these kind of things exist for salmonids and small streams and things like that, but we're working in a river that can be 2 meters deep or deeper. Very hard to get in with machines, very hard for divers. And this is one of the shallower spawning sites that we know of. So we have a tool that seems to be able to do this on an experimental basis. We did those experiments in one of these side channels, but we know it's temporary. So what we're looking at now, and we haven't done it yet, but this is what we're planning to do, is clean over a larger area than we've ever cleaned before. That will be quite a task. And also excavate a sand trap upstream. So basically dig a hole, trap any sand that's going to move downstream. And then right before the spawning period, they spawn May 15th to June 15th, and the ice comes off in this river on April 15th. So we have a very short window to get in and improve things. And we couldn't go in and improve them in October because the sand would have moved in by the time the spawning comes. So we have a very short work window. And that's what we're going to try as our next experiment. It's fairly large scale. Based on everything, it should work, but we have to go out and try it. And so I'm going to leave, that's kind of where we're at on the Nechako River. There's a ton of background work here, and I'd love to talk to people about that more. I'll also just jump to the Columbia River to show that we're doing similar things on the Columbia River. Here we are. This is the Keenly Side Dam, which is located near Castlegar. You can see it in these maps barely here. We know, and this on this side is the Arrow Lakes generating station, and we know that fish spawn in the tail race of the Arrow Lakes generating station from multiple years of egg capture data. So a project led by BC Hydro, but partnered with us and others. We placed, or BC Hydro really placed rock, I think it was about 5,000 square meters of treatment area downstream. And the nice thing here where it's low dam, so fines are limited from upstream. So this should last a long time, and this has been used elsewhere in sturgeon spawning habitat elsewhere for other species. So this is the project as it was completed in 2023. We also embedded, this is exciting, but I've left it out of a talk, these subsurface monitors in the gravel bed to monitor the infilling. And that was kind of a new approach, and they're embedded, and we give us real-time long-term monitoring of the substrate condition. So substrate was placed 60 centimeter depth over this large area, placed from a barge with large machines. It was challenging, but they did it. We got spawning there in 2023, caught larvae that were a little bit older than we've caught previously, so that seems to work. But we won't get any juveniles until 7 years old because they don't recruit to the gear. So we've done this $2 million experiment and we don't really get any results for 7 years, which is a challenge with an endangered species. We have to keep doing things, but a 7-year time lag to get results is challenging. But successful, everything leads us this direction. It should work. And so I think we're showing good progress. I'm gonna jump now to one of the other issues, which is these mortalities that we saw in 2022. It was a surprise. We've seen mortalities in the lower Fraser River, but never from the Nechako, which is an endangered population. We saw 12 fish dead in a 2-week time span. They're all big, older fish. They were all male. And with a adult population of 535, that's about 2% mortality in 2 weeks. So for an endangered population, this is not good, especially when you can't explain why they died. We're looking at multiple avenues for mortality, but nothing really stands out. And this is a collaboration with Juan Jose Alava, Mina Hassan Agay, and Nicholas Gantner, who works with the province. And we're focusing on the toxicological side. So some really interesting results coming up, not conclusive, just beginning to get into it, looking at heavy metals in the PCBs, and Mina's leading this and gonna bring it into her PhD. So that's great and super exciting to have that. Just one little piece of data. So mercury is one you might look at, large fish that will bioaccumulate. And that's the mercury data from the tissue samples we collected. And these are reference samples either from the watershed years ago, from other watersheds. And this number 13 is a small juvenile that wasn't dead. So certainly these fish are bioaccumulating mercury. That seems to be the case. Did it kill them? Well, you don't know, but the numbers are high. This is another interesting one that's come up, which is the Health Value Benefit Index. Selenium seems to help detoxify mercury. And then when you create this index, and there's a formula for it, but when you look at it, you see both positive values here in this juvenile. That's what you would expect. And then for the adults, this weird juxtaposition of low values, so negative values, which is bad in the muscle, but positive values in the liver. We don't know what that means yet, but it's just a really interesting signal that something strange is going on between selenium and mercury. And then just one other quick one. Mina sent me this plot. This is just PCBs. This is one of the most common and long-lasting PCBs, 153. It is mixed a bit with 158, but predominantly this will be a 153 signal. And you do see, we've aged the fish, and you do see evidence of bioaccumulation. So we were just on a call this morning talking about other PCBs. So there's going to be some really neat work coming out on the PCB loads in these fish in particular. And we'll be doing sampling of the general population as well, just to see how well it matches. So again, more to come. That's a really interesting piece of work. And then one last piece of work. This again, when these fish died, we thought maybe there's some physiological, there's multiple stressors going on. So let's look at physiological indicators as well. This is Madison Earhart, who recently finished her PhD in December, and now she's doing a postdoc in zoology. And she's looking at, combined effects of elevated temperature. All these fish, these big fish, seem to have salmon in their gut. Now, that would be natural because they feed on salmon, so it's not too surprising. But it's a common feature when we see sturgeon mortalities, high temperatures, sockeye in their guts, and large size. So how do these combine, and what's going on for these fish? I will show, we don't have any data on that yet. We do have some data, and this kind of touches on the work that Mohammed Oyinlolo is doing with modeling, but he's doing longer term climate change stuff. But, from Madison's thesis, we've got these optimal ranges for the early life stages, bit of a gap for feeding larvae. And these are temperature plots at the spawning site. And most years, if you look at them, I've only got 3 up here, most years are actually not bad. Kind of like this one where the red bars delineate the spawning period. So that would be okay. It rises up in the summer. Some are bad. This one would have beyond the optimal range during the spawning window. And then this is the heat dome in 21. It was pretty good when they spawned, but then boom, temperature shot up later in the summer. So we're just kind of getting into this thermal impacts and what does the future look like for this species. But I'm super excited. We had a meeting with Madison yesterday, some really interesting work, and really looking, I think this is one of the neat tools. She's looking at genomic indicators of thermal stress. So can we go out and take a blood sample and tell how thermally stressed that individual is? They've done a bunch of lab work to support this, and so now we're taking it out into the field. And with the real idea of what sublethal samples can we take to learn about the condition of these fish. And I'll just finish it off with this lovely video. This is us. So we're fishing in the lower Fraser River. And that was one of the fish that she was able to sample. And there we get to let it go. And it's a nice slow motion. It is so... I just love, it's so amazing to work with these huge fish. It's unfortunately we have to catch them by hook and line, but it is so wonderful to work with them and just releasing them and seeing them swim. It's just thrilling. So I'll finish it off there just by acknowledging we do work with a ton of partners on this. Our own ministry, the federal government, there's a bunch of First Nations involvement in all the watersheds. The Fraser River White Sturgeon Conservation Society, BC Hydro has done a bunch of the work on the Columbia, and then this is the Nechako Environmental Enhancement Fund that supports a bunch of my work as well. Yes. And if there are any questions, please dive in. And I'm in the building on the 3rd floor and always willing to talk. And it has sound, so I'll lean close. Yep.
And that was a incredible huge depth.
It was the 5th largest in the world at the time, yeah.
A lot of water taken out of the Fraser. And so that vastly changed the hydrology and sort of sediment flow system in the Nechako. So have people reconstructed and have the records of the hydrology and sediment sort of pattern prior to downing, and then see how that turns out?
Yes and no. So aerial photos are amazing, and the ability to interpret aerial photos. So we do have aerial photos like that reach I showed you used to be all gravel bars, and now it's turned into vegetated islands. And that's, so yes, you can do it from aerial photos, and we can do it in some of our models. So you can take the hydraulic models and then you can change the channel geometry and say, how would the water have flowed previously? We've done a lot of that as well. But you're right. I mean, when you take 2/3 of the water out, it fundamentally changes the channel form. And I think this is one of the things we're finding challenging is we're 7 years down the road. So there's been 7 years of habitat change under a new flow regime. And it's very hard to then go, oh, we'll just, do one thing and change it back. This is an altered habitat now, and so working in altered habitats is very challenging.
And also damming creates a lot of mercury. A lot of mercury systems that are down.
Probably not. So mercury is going to come in the reservoir with the flooding of habitats, and that's going to come in probably a 30-year pulse, and then it will die down. But if you know the Nechako watershed, the Stewart watershed flows into it, and the Pinchy fault zone is a mercury-rich geological feature that's just north of there. So we do have geologies that are fairly rich in mercury in the area. So it's not surprising that we have mercury coming into these fish. But what the lethal levels, we really don't know.